to the first of the Melbourne Press Club's new series in this brave new world that we're all in here via Zoom. Today we're talking about what to do if you're raided. My name's Ashlynne McGhee. I'm a journalist at the ABC's 7:30 program, and I'm also the Vice President of the Melbourne Press Club, and I'm really glad you're all able to join us, if not in person, at least here via Zoom. Now, our topic today, what to do if you're raided. I can't think of two people who I would prefer to turn to for advice on this topic. Our first guest is Peter Bartlett. Peter is a partner at Minter Ellison. He is the lawyer that you want in your corner if you are ever subject to any kind of warrant or raid with any kind of agency, police or otherwise. He's one of this country's finest lawyers and when needs be, one of this country's finest attack dogs as well. So I'm really pleased that Peter Bartlett from Minter Ellison is here with us today. We also have John Lyons, who is the boss you want in your corner if you're ever facing a situation like this. After a long and illustrious career on the road, both here in Australia and abroad, John Lyons is now the head of investigations at the ABC and oversees some programs like Four Corners and 7:30, as well as the entire investigations team. So he's a journo's journo, and like I say, there's no one else that you'd want in your corner. Now, events like this, whether they're in person or online, aren't possible without the support of our fabulous sponsors at the Melbourne Press Club. I'd like to acknowledge our two principal sponsors, Monash University and Virgin Australia. We also have our premium sponsors, Commonwealth Bank, Crown Resorts and Minter Ellison. So thank you again for their fabulous support that enables us to put on panels like this. Now, we'll get started with a short discussion and then we will open up to some questions, which we will get you to submit via the chat on your screen. We'll keep an eye across that and just bear with us while we try to get through the questions as well. So I wanted to start by asking you, Peter, if you're about to be raided, what are the first signs? When do you first know?
Well, the reality is you're given no advance warning at all. I remember some years ago being in my office in a meeting and had a call from Paul Ramage, then Editor-in-Chief of The Age, saying that he needed me down at The Age because there were 7 or 8 police there with a search warrant. And I raced down there. They had no indication at all, no prior indication. These 7 or 8 police came in quite heavy-handed, quite intimidating, throwing around this search warrant. So it was a very nervous time for the reporters. These were top reporters from The Age, Nick McKenzie, Royce Miller, and others. And obviously they have a vast amount of relevant material on their computers and on their telephone records.
Is there any other time other than a dawn raid?
Well, I think a lot of them, strangely, do come early in the morning. There was another reporter related to the same story, and the police arrived on his doorstep about 7 a.m. in the morning. The lead policeman had a video camera going with a very strong searchlight type light on it, and the door was opened by his 7-year-old son. And again, very, very intimidating. And these are police who most of the time are doing raids on criminals or alleged criminals. These are reporters just doing their job.
John, you're no stranger to raids. What's your tally at the moment?
Well, I'm not sure of the exact number, but my first experience was 20 years ago when I wrote a series of articles for the Bulletin magazine based on some defence intelligence documents that someone had given me. And the first I knew of that was I got a phone call from Laurie Oakes, the famous Channel 9 political reporter who had actually been leaked a copy of the warrant. And he, admirably rang me and said, listen, I'm sitting here with a warrant, I think, to do with your story. I think you'll probably be raided tonight or tomorrow. And I said, at that point I was fairly junior and he'd had much more experience than me, Laurie. So I said, what do I do? And he said, you should, from the moment they arrive, film from every possible angle, any cameras you have in the house, and I'll lead Channel 9 News on Saturday night with the story. Now, what often happens before a raid is the police, the federal police and other agencies often will be tapping your phones so in the days leading up to a raid, just so they know about that sort of conversation. They know whether you're going to be there, whether you're going to have guests staying. And I suspect that the federal police, when they heard Laurie Oates say, I will lead Channel 9 News with it tomorrow night, I suspect that was enough to actually put them off, because they never turned up. They raided almost everybody else, by the way, who was referred to on the warrant, but fortunately not me.
I wanted to come to something you raised there, which is about them listening into your phone calls. And I wanted to come to that a little bit later. But I just want to go back a little bit. Before you get raided, before you even get to that point, what kinds of things do you do, John, or do you advise your reporters to do to actually prepare? So you're not in a position where, you've got a phone number laying around here, a sensitive document there.
Well, Ash, I think basically you prepare these days. We have to prepare every day. From the moment you even think of a story, you have to assume two things. You're going to be sued for defamation, and secondly, you're going to be raided by somebody or other. Some agency out there won't like it if it embarrasses the government. So my bottom line, my message to a lot of the key people I work with at the ABC is, these things, mobile phones, are essentially a thing of the past when it comes to your contacts. Never, ever turn up to a meeting with anybody who'll have anything to do with a story with your phone. And that's a big thing for us, because we rely on our phones for everything. Leave your phone at home. The best thing I've said to people, if you want to leak a story, the old snail mail. Because if a letter arrives, I've started to get anonymous letters at the ABC since I went on Raffi Epstein's show in Melbourne a few months ago, and someone rang up and said, what do we do if we want to give you a story? And I said, please send it in snail mail. So the following week, this beautiful package arrived at my desk with all these drawings and plans for a new development and council and breaking laws or whatever. That's what we need, because the federal police or the council authorities, the Victorian government, no one can trace that. So basically you have to be assuming every moment that you cannot leave any trail. You can have not even to your contacts, let's catch up for coffee. You have to try to go and see them in person. I sometimes knock on the doors of lawyers, barristers, judges or whatever if I'm walking by the city, and drop in and say, can we have time for a chat? So there's no electronic trail.
In terms of documents, what's the best way to be storing those? Because obviously sometimes you get paper copies, sometimes you get electronic copies. What do you do with them?
I think that you should look at a document. It'd be interesting to hear what Peter thinks about this. I don't think we should store sensitive documents and keep them anymore. My advice would be, if you get a confidential document, take it to your manager and editor, sit there with them, the two of you, take handwritten notes of the document, so you've at least got another person and a witness, take key notes of key words and whatever, and then destroy the document. I would get rid of it. This is before anybody serves warrants, anyone's interested. I think as a matter of tradecraft, we shouldn't be keeping these things, because they can always lead back to a source. I'm not talking about legality or illegality. I think as best practice, we shouldn't be holding on to documents. And I know that goes against all our instincts to have but I know a Four Corners reporter who years ago started the practice of, before every program, he would get a huge pile of his documents on the Monday afternoon before it went to air, and bang, all gone. What
do you think, Peter?
Well, there are two schools of thought. I think I remember the first search warrant that I got involved in was David Wilson, who was a wonderful investigative reporter from many, many years ago. And the Australian Federal Police turned up at, again, the Age. And he had an office in the days when journalists actually had offices and weren't hot desking or whatever. And his office was chockers to the roof with paper and files. And it was extraordinary. And these police were there for a couple of weeks going through all of this material. It was staggering. But John's right in what he says. But the reality is, as he also mentioned, that a journalist has to take into account that they may be sued. And if they are sued, and then the lawyers come in for the media company and for the reporter and say, okay, what's the evidence? The lawyers love paper. The lawyers love hard evidence that they can introduce into court. And it makes it very difficult if all of the source material has been destroyed.
That's an interesting point Peter raises, and we've got to a point now with the surveillance state that we're in, that we essentially have to choose between the lesser of two evils, I think. Yeah. That is to defend a defamation action or to risk giving up a source. And my view is when we are confronted, we can always fight a defamation case later on, as Peter knows, but once a source has been given up, that's it. And I think our absolutely inviolable commitment is to never, ever give up a source. So to me, if we have to trade off in this world we're in now between those two choices of having 100 documents to fight a defamation case or risking giving up a source, I will protect the source and try to also defend the defamation action.
Yeah, well, we have ways and means of obviously trying to protect sources. It's very rare over the years where a source has actually been outed. But it is so expensive now, as John knows and as every editor knows, to fight a defamation action. Some of the awards that have been made over recent years against the media are frightening. Millions and millions of dollars we've seen in the last 12 months. The legal costs are astronomical. Our defamation laws are outrageously pro-plaintiff. And so the lawyers for the media companies need everything going for them that they possibly can to try and win and get a successful result out of a defamation case. And it is very difficult if you don't have that source material. So I agree with everything John says, but there's another side to it.
But if I can just add the rider there are certain documents that are, say, from a national security cabinet that won't reveal a source or key parts of that. I'm saying, Les, keep those key sort of documents, but anything at all that will reveal a source, I think that they're the ones that should be protected.
So let me try and broker a deal here between the journalist and the lawyer. Is it a solution that the journalist's copies of the documents are destroyed and a copy is made and left with the lawyers? Because then a lawyer's subject to being raided over a story.
Well, lawyers would then claim legal professional privilege over those documents and would have a significant fight over that. So that's,
you can be raided as well.
Yeah, lawyers can be raided. I remember hearing law firms have been raided over tax-related matters where they've been acting for clients who have been investigated by the Australian Tax Office. So lawyers' offices can be raided.
Okay.
Ashlynne, that's probably one of the better sort of middle courses that we can think of at the moment. It's the safest place for the documents to be, I think.
Let's just step back to an actual raid itself. So you've got either a policeman or someone from one of the agencies knocking at your door, either your home or your office. What do you actually do in that moment? And I might go to you first, Peter. What are the first things you say to them? What are the first things you do? What are the first calls you make? What are your rights at that point?
Well, the first thing you do is to look at the terms of the search warrant, because a search warrant would be normally related to a particular article or particular news program on television. And so you look at the terms of that. You then see what they're trying to do. So in the last time the Melbourne Age was raided, the police wanted to take all of their computers and phone records. And we said, well, you can't do that because the search warrant relates to one investigation into allegations that reporters had accessed the ALP database. That's a very small issue. It was probably 2% of the reporter's computer material. So we said, you can't take the computers. And they said, oh, yes, we can. And we're taking them. And so Paul Ramage and I physically ran up to the Supreme Court. And the police laughed at us and said, well, no one's ever got an injunction against us. And we got an injunction. And the judge said, the search warrant only relates to about 2% or something on the computers. So you can't take them. So we cooperated.
While police was still there, police was still in the Age's offices, and you got the injunction at the same time.
Well, that was interesting, actually, because the police said that they were taking the computers, and I said to them, and they actually got the chief communications officer for the police down to the Age officers, And I said, well, that will be a huge front page story if you take these computers and stop us from having time to get up to the Supreme Court. And they said, we're going. And we were just walking into the Supreme Court, and the chief police officer rang me and said, oh, we've been delayed. We'll still be at the Age for a while. But it was interesting. Convenient. The judge said, no, you can't take those computers. So the police physically slept at the Age office next to the computers for 1 week while we were cooperating with them and getting out of these computers the 2% of material subject to the search warrant. It was a fascinating exercise.
In terms of when you have someone turn up like that, how long can you, say they come to your door, how long can you delay them at the door? Like, can they just come straight in and as we saw in the case of Annika Smethurst, start going through your underwear drawer? Or can you say, well, hang on a second, I need to call my lawyer, my editor, I need some advice here. How much wriggle room is there?
It's interesting. That was actually done with David Wilson. And of course, David's no longer with us, but they were able to delay the police at the entrance to the Age building. And I was only told weeks and weeks after that, surprisingly, a couple of folders disappeared from David's office before the police actually got into the office. But I can only say that because David's no longer with us.
And hopefully they're still not looking for the folders. In terms of the approach you take, John, obviously you took a very public approach when the ABC was raided by the AFP last June, and you live tweeted what was happening. And I think it was you that mentioned earlier, or perhaps Peter, filming the whole thing. Do you recommend that approach? Go public, go fast?
Well, Ashlynne, I think it depends whether it's your office or your home. I had freedom at the ABC when the Federal Police raided because I wasn't on the warrant, so they couldn't take my phone. They didn't like it. They said the following weekend, one of the Federal Police officers said to someone from the ABC, if Lyons had been a bikie, we would have cuffed him on the day. They're used to raiding ice factories, amphetamines factories, counter-terrorism. That's their thing, which in a way highlights the point we're sort of making. If it's your office, it's much easier. Channel 7, Bruce Guthrie, The Age, many famous occasions of media coming in and filming. If it's at your home, it's a bit trickier because the phone that you would film them on or record them on is probably they can take under their warrant. So the best thing is either you have a partner who can film. They can't take every phone in the house if it's owned by your partner, or I would, if it happened and my wife couldn't film, I would ask a neighbour to come in and film. They're allowed to. There's nothing to stop them coming in and out of the house. And I think it's almost a sort of a protection. They should be filmed, everything they're doing, everything they're taking. It's a record of this. Because, you know, we had the reason, by the way, that the 6 armed federal police officers let the ABC know 24 hours beforehand they were coming was because, not that they wanted to be polite, but they wouldn't have known where to go at the ABC, all like The Age. Big offices, which office do you go to? Which computer do you go to? So they needed guidance as to the computer system, etc. But a house, they do a dawn raid, obviously, to get you at your sort of most vulnerable. You're not prepared. The first thing is stay very calm. If you work for an organisation, call a lawyer or your editor. If you're a freelance or in regional Australia, try to get someone to film it as your own protection. And also, I was very polite and respectful to the Federal Police at the ABC. They asked me why I was doing it, and I said, we're a news organisation, we cover news events. They looked at each other and they couldn't really argue with that. So I think that to stay calm, because it's a very violating and intrusive experience, especially if it's in your own home.
It's a hard thing to do, staying calm when that happens.
Yes, but it's really important. Or call on someone, call your editor, someone who can come to the house and sort of help you negotiate your way, because it will probably go on for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours.
Yeah, okay. We'll come to some questions in a moment. We've had a couple come through on the Zoom chat, so if you've got any, pop them in there now and we will start answering those in just a minute. I just wanted to finish up by asking something that John mentioned earlier, Peter, was about his phone. He suspected his phone being monitored ahead of that raid. What kind of monitoring or surveillance can police or security agencies do on journalists without us knowing?
Well, we would never know. The reporter would never know. The police can go to a court official and get a warrant to be able to tap into telephones. I think that there are records saying there were surprising figures published some months ago of the number of reporters who actually had their phones accessed. The reporters would never know. I've had probably an exaggeration, but reporters say to me that while they're talking to me, the federal police or the state police are probably listening. It is, I think, quite surprisingly common.
Okay. John, did you have anything to add to that?
I would only add that about 99% or 98% of requests for telephone intercept warrants by the federal police are granted. So,
yeah.
And judges, for reasons I don't understand, almost always give them the ability to tap a phone. I think it's just gone way too far.
And it's an interesting point that the Law Council of Australia came out after the News Limited and ABC raids and said that warrants should only be issued by a Supreme Court judge or a judge of a higher court, that judge should take into account public interest issues, and that there should also be a public advocate, someone independent, a barrister who's independent, who would give that judge a different opinion rather than simply the police opinion as to why the warrant should be issued. And I think that they are three very strong recommendations that the Attorney General should seriously look at.
And of course, they haven't been implemented yet, so we end up in the position that we're in now, and we're having a discussion that it would be preferable not to be having, but I thank you too for being part of it. We'll open up to some questions now, and we might go to this one first because I guess it goes exactly to that. One of our participants says, I've been in this business in Melbourne for 30 years. I don't recall oversight of this magnitude, intensity and bulldoggedness. I wonder if John and Peter might venture a theory into why now, what's led to this current situation. John, do you want to go first?
Sorry, meaning the current situation as to?
As in why police are pursuing journalists at the rate and the intensity that they are at the moment. Why is it amped up?
Well, I think over the last 10 years, they've accreted to themselves a lot more power. The agencies have unprecedented power. That's been happening for 10, 12 years. Both sides of politics have agreed to it. So they now have full power. The warrant that they used on the ABC was actually frightening in its wording. It gave the federal police the power to alter and delete, change documents in the ABC's computer system. I mean, that is George Orwell stuff. That's completely out of control. I mean, if you want to seize a document, I can understand the rationale for it, but to alter and change and delete in our system, they try to use whatever powers they have, and that's why we have to try to wind the powers back.
Peter, do you have any thoughts on why it's so intense at the moment?
Well, I found it very interesting that Ita Buttrose, chair of the ABC, came out because, as you know, the raid on News Limited, a reporter, and the ABC were 2 days, one after the other. And Ita Buttrose came out and said, well, this is clear intimidation by the Australian Federal Police. Now, that's obviously been denied, but it's too much of a coincidence that you would get 2 of our leading media companies raided on following days.
Yeah, Ashlynne, if I could just add to that, to Peter's point, on the Monday of that week, they rang Ben Fordham at 2GB here in Sydney and wanted to know his source for a story. That's the Home Affairs Department. He refused to give it. On the Tuesday morning, they raided Annika Smethurst's house in Canberra. On the Wednesday morning, they hit the ABC. And on the Thursday, and I've had this confirmed from News Corp sources, on the Thursday, they were planning a raid on the Holt Street, Surrey Hills headquarters of News Corp. So why would all of this happen 3 weeks after a federal election when some of these issues went back years? I think it's really important to try to work out Who's driving all of this? It's a very good question that was asked.
Absolutely. We'll go to a question now from another participant. Let me just scroll up and find it. As a partner of a journalist, is my equipment subject to seizure if we're raided? And are internationally hosted cloud services protected from seizure? We might go to you, Peter. Can you answer that one for us?
Well, I think John's point before is relevant. It's a matter, again, of looking at the terms of the search warrant. And the search warrant would normally be naming a particular reporter or the news outlet. And so if it's a partner's telephone, then that you would not expect that to be covered by the search warrant. So the police have no right to go near that phone. And that phone, as John mentioned before, can be used to record and video what's actually happening. And that should be done.
In terms of the cloud platforms, there are a whole bunch of them that people use. How secure are they? Are they subject to, can they, say, bypass myself or John as a journalist, and can they go straight to the server or the company that provides it and access our information?
Well, John's possibly better on the technology than I am, but I know that reporters I speak to have some confidence in these types of this type of technology, and so it's being used more and more.
What do you think, John? How secure are they?
I don't think anything is secure anymore. I think that whatever comes up, a signal might come up. You know, you can, sometimes people send me the messages that disappear in an hour. If you're being monitored, they're going to see it for that hour. You know, they have so much facility. In fact, we're seeing a different form of it with the COVID app, how two people coming together. What they can do, and they have been able to do it for years, is if they think a journalist is doing something in the defence or intelligence area, and that's their really sensitive area, and they have a particular person in the department, in the public service, in the military, who they think could be a leak, they will put in those two mobile phone numbers. And at any point that those two numbers come within a kilometre or a half a kilometre of each other, an alarm will go off in their computer system. So they can then tell that journalist X is meeting with public servant Y. That's why I can't stress enough, these things, you know, anything sensitive, forget about them, leave them as far away from you as possible.
Yeah, okay. A question from Lois. She says, how likely is it that informers will receive stronger legal protections in relation to breaches of confidence? And could this reduce the reach of government agencies in identifying sources? Now, assume by informers she means whistleblowers. Peter, do you want to answer that one?
Well, the trouble with our whistleblower legislation, and certainly it has been strengthened, and our shield laws have been introduced in a lot of the states and territories and the Commonwealth. The problem with them are that there are always holes in them. The shield laws protect sources and protect journalists, but only if the judge thinks that there's not a good reason to overturn it. So if the judge takes the view it's in the interests of justice to force the reporter to disclose, there's no protection. So our whistleblower and our shield laws are far too weak.
Okay. Chris asks, is there any legal ability to uncover information when a police, I'm paraphrasing here, a police organisation has investigated a journalist in a way that's less overt than a raid? So even if that investigation is over, can we find out about it? Is there any kind of disclosure scheme? John?
Well, Peter would know the legal side of that better than me, but yeah, my understanding is that it would be very difficult to find out any information about that sort of thing. I mean, I keep making the point, it's now going on to 2.5 years since Dan Oakes and Sam Clark in Melbourne have been subject to possible criminal charges. I think it's absolutely outrageous that Angus Taylor, a minister, can have his case cleared within a few weeks. He refuses to be interviewed by the federal police, which is interesting. They don't even interview the other key person, Clover Moore, but the federal police say nothing to see here, everything's good. And yet 2 of our journalists have been twisting in the wind for 2.5 years, and we couldn't find out, to answer the question, what was the status of the investigation. All we know is that they have not told us that they're no longer under investigation. And even when it's over, I don't think we're going to be able to find out the course of the investigation. I understand some things have to be kept confidential in a society like ours to protect the public. I completely understand that about police and national security and defence matters. But this is the situation we're in now is an outrageous abuse of power of the state, of government departments, the Defence Department, the Home Affairs Department in particular, and they don't care. They don't seem to care what are the consequences on those journalists.
Peter, is there any way of finding out whether your phone's been tapped or there are some other less overt surveillance that's been undertaken or an investigation? Like, how do I know if I've ever been investigated? Will I ever know?
You will never know unless you're prosecuted or unless they turn up on your front door. You don't know whether they are tapping your phone. You don't know if you're under surveillance. You don't know if the television, videos going on of all of your movements in your house or whatever. The authorities these days have a colossal amount of resources to really interfere with your right to privacy. And I think that's happening more and more.
Absolutely. A comment and a question from Anna saying, Peter, I was the person who called you that day working with Paul Ramage at the A. So there you go. The question from Anna is that she recalls that police focused on the computers of the journalists in question, and would it not be better for them to be using another computer or another email address to sort of muddy the waters a little bit?
Yeah, well, that's done all the time. I remember Anna did phone and I said, well, I'm in a meeting and I should be able to get down there in about an hour. And Paul Ramage came onto the phone and said, I want you now. So luckily it was only a couple of blocks away. It's a real issue. The police are there. It is so intimidating. And you're right in saying that the reporters should use, different phones, different computers, different everything that they can. But the resources available to the police is so vast that, John's right in saying that the phone just should never be used.
And Ash, if I can just add to that, we're almost back to the future now. The safest, best equipment a journalist now has is a pen and a paper.
And Australia Post, who would have thought?
That's it, an Australia Post,
And remember those court cases we had a long, long time ago when reporters had this scribble that no one could read what their notes were saying. So
and then Lou Milligan had to sit there and Four Corners reporter had to transcribe her shorthand for the court. And the shorthand was, I've seen the most extraordinary shorthand. How journalists can possibly know what they've written, I have no idea. And of course, it's fantastic for the police because they have no idea what they've got there. If only we all learned shorthand still.
Yeah.
We've had a clarification from someone in the audience as well saying regarding cloud devices, they think it depends on the jurisdiction in which the data is stored. For example, the Cloud Act in the US may permit law enforcement to access it via a legal process if it's stored on a US server. So that's from someone in the audience.
Well, that's an interesting point. That we saw Annika raided, we saw the ABC raided, but Australia is a member of this Five Eyes security network, and yet Canada, New Zealand, the United States have far more protection for journalists than we see in Australia.
And vastly better defamation protections as well. You could
Absolutely.
Say. It's interesting because we often report on so many of these Keystone Cop type stories where you see bumbling, fuddling, muddling police and agencies, and then to think that they have this level of sophistication and ability to surveil journalists in this way when they choose to. And of course, that's why we're here, unfortunately, having this conversation. We'll wrap up in just a moment, but I just wanted to ask you both for your final thoughts on this issue and get you to sort of wrap up in conclusion. Peter, your final thoughts?
Okay, so, we have, I think, in this country, the most extraordinary quality of reporters, news reporters, investigative reporters, so many others. And from time to time, they get a great story. They have sources. They have wonderful sources. And we need those reporters because, you know, in a democracy, you need a free press. And at the moment, there are far too many restrictions on the media and what they can publish. That really does need to be addressed. And it's the first time I've ever seen all the media companies united in approaching the governments and saying something has to give. Freedom of speech is deteriorating year after year, and all the media companies need to keep putting pressure on government to get change.
John.
Well, Ash, two things. Firstly, the tradecraft that we do. I think we have to be conscious of the fact now we have to not have contact, emails, texts, etc. with our sources. We have to go out of the office, meet them in person, leave our phone behind, etc. But secondly, I think as journalists, we have to try to frame this discussion not in terms of poor journalists or even how bad for whistleblowers. We've got to actually let the public know that they are the victims in this. I can't understand why journalists should know a lot of things and the public doesn't. I've spoken to some investigative journalists, probably 60% of what they know, legitimate genuine stories, can't be published. So we've got to let the public know and get them on side that if you're a whistleblower in a hospital in Geelong, or you're on a local council, or you're at a sports club or something and you see corruption, that they've got to know they can come to us if they've got no other avenue. We've got to make the public understand that this is about them. It's not about us. It's about them knowing how their country works.
Absolutely, and that all journalists work as hard as they can to protect their sources and to make sure we get the best stories out there. Look, thank you both so much for your time today. Thank you to our audience for coming along on this wild ride on Zoom with us. If you've got any feedback about this event or future events that you'd like to see the Melbourne Press Club host, please get in touch with the club, because we're very much busy and active. We're just not in the office like we usually are. And again, thank you to our two panellists today, John Lyons, the head of ABC Investigations, and Peter Bartlett, a partner at Midge Rellis. And these really are the two people that you would want in your corner if you're rated. So we really appreciate it. And thank you again, everyone, for being part of this panel. We'll see you soon. Thank you.